Welcome everyone. I hope you had a nice afternoon tea break. Thanks so much for coming back to the session which looks at our food futures. I'm really pleased to introduce two terrific speakers today. We have Dr. Stephen LIAROS will be talking about circular food futures and what they'll look like. And Michelle Miller will be very kindly sharing with us some of her ideas about, lost my button, about agricultural systems. And Michelle will give you more info about all of that. So the format is roughly, we have 50 minutes. So we've got 15 to 20 minutes for Steve to give his talk, and then 5 minutes for questions or whatever we need. Michelle has got 20 to 25 minutes for what she's calling a discussion. So it's pretty much the same kind of thing, I guess, a bit of a presentation and then a discussion. For those joining us in this session, if you've got questions as you go along, please write them in the chat. But when we come to Q&A, you're very welcome to take the mute button off and just ask a question or directly chat to our speakers. It's a small session. That's what the parallel ones are for. So we have time for chatting. Over to you, Dr. LIAROS.
Thanks, Michelle. So my name is Stephen LIAROS. I'm coming to you from Darug and Gurungai country on the northern edge of Sydney. The presentation I'll present today is circular food futures, what will they look like? And I'm going to make the case that a fully circular food system would be co-located with the places that we live. And in order to have that regenerative circular food system where we're recycling organic material where we live, we also need a circular water system, so manage a water cycle locally. And in order to do that, we need a renewable energy microgrid in the places that we live. So how does this work? Okay, so the model that we're developing at Polis Plan is we're calling circular economy villages, which integrate renewable energy microgrids, water microgrids, and regenerative food system in a shared equity ownership model where people can live and work in the places that they also produce their food, water, and energy. The presentation today is based on this paper that was just published this year of the same name, and I can share that information with you later, or you could just drop down the name. So the challenges of our current food system, and I want to talk about this divergence between increasing expectations from consumers at the same time that there's a range of increasing pressures on producers of food. And the question I want to ask is, how can circular economy debates contribute to the changes needed and the challenges of our food system, and how we create a sustainable food system? Now, one important point I want to make here is to talk about the circular economy not as an incremental improvement of the current system, but a way of imagining the future of a fully circular system. If we were to imagine it to be fully circular, what would it look like? And a lot of the conversations around the circular economy at the moment are about incremental improvements of the current system, making it a little bit more circular rather than imagining a fully circular system. And just to make that point, again, there's been lots of literature about the circular economy, and this one by Kershaw article talks about 114 different definitions of the circular economy. And the circular economy started with the discussion around reuse, reduce, reuse, recycle. It was 3 R's, it became 4 R's, then it became 5 R's and 6 R's. So but all of them are strategies for incrementally improving the current system rather than envisioning a preferred circular future. So we don't want to simply improve circularity, we want objectives for designing a fully circular system. And to do that, I use this definition from the Macarthur Foundation, which has these basic points of designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in circulation, and regenerating natural systems. And if we convert those strategies into objectives, then our preferred future is one that has zero waste and zero pollution, one where products and materials are kept perpetually in circulation, And the food economy regenerates natural systems. So we use that food production system to also regenerate or contribute to the regeneration of natural systems. And I'll break this presentation up into 3 sections, one on zero waste, zero pollution, and cluster the last 2 together to talk about regenerative agriculture. So the first is to talk about waste in the food system, and there's plenty of studies, this one from the UN, to talk about how about 1/3 of the food system, or food produced in our industrial food system, is wasted. It's not consumed. It's lost along the way, and the causes initially is increased urbanization, and so the separation of people from their food production. With that urbanization, we started to get longer and longer supply chains. So now we have global supply chains. So there's the longer that supply chain, the more risk there is of damage and spoilage along the way, and the more need for packaging and processing. And also the shift from starchy staples, which was the diet before the Industrial Revolution, to much shorter shelf life products, increasing protein and so on. And so to design out waste, we would need to reconnect people to the food system to significantly reduce the length of the supply chain. And that way, short shelf life products would no longer be a problem. And also any wasted food could be composted in order to produce more food. So the way we think about composting at the moment is that we're composting and improving our backyards, but we're continually degrading the food producing areas. So the organic material is leaving the farms, coming to our backyards. So that's not a closed system. We need that composting to improve the soil where food is being produced. So the next area is, how do we design out pollution? And the brief answer to that is we eliminate fossil fuels and we shift to renewable energy sources. Now, to put some rigor around this, there's a lot of studies around the energy return on investment, how much energy, and this is fossil fuel energy, we need to put in to get the same, or how many calories in or joules in fossil fuels to get calories out of the system. So it's comparing calories with calories. And this particular study finds that in the more developed countries, we use a lot more input energy to produce the food that we need to produce. And this is because there's a lot more human and animal labor and therefore less pollution in the less developed countries, or the countries that are not using as much in the way of fossil fuels. But all of these studies talk about the food at the farm gate, food produced at the farm gate, and exclude the costs of wasted food and the infrastructure needed, the embodied energy needed in the infrastructure to transport food over the long supply chains that we talked about. So if we do take all of that into account, and this is a study from the United States where it talks about their food system there, and what this study found was that if you account for transport and processing and packaging and storage and all the wastage along the way, then you need 7.4 calories of food, of energy to produce 1 calorie of food energy. So there's 6.4 calories lost. So it's the very definition of an unsustainable food system or energy system, when there's more energy going in than is coming out of the system. So it's constantly being degraded. The system as a whole is degraded. So to design out pollution, we need no fossil fuels production, processing, storage, or transport of food. So we need to produce food where people live. And this allows the consumers to provide the occasional labor for food production. It reduces energy for transport and storage. It reduces energy requirements for processing and packaging. And a local energy microgrid can support the irrigation and production of that system. So we use that energy system to produce the food, renewable energy system to produce the food. And that takes us to our third area of how we regenerate natural systems and keep organic materials in circulation. And we can come to this from the perspective of regenerative agriculture. And this is some of the basic principles is to maximize the capture of energy, improve the water cycle. So there again, you see that connection between energy and water and food production. Improve the soil mineral cycle by creating healthy soils and maximizing biodiversity. And the food, water and energy nexus is another area of discussion about the future of the food system. How do we integrate those things? And if we're co-locating producers with consumers, then we can add housing to the nexus. So we start talking about a food, water, energy, housing nexus. And therefore we need to start thinking of villages or places in which we align with natural ecological cycles, we integrate energy, water, food systems with the built environment. And so we create these integrated systems-based environments in which we live. And so, of course, what we need is another agricultural revolution where we're essentially creating a network of these distributed food systems aligned with or co-located with the places that we live. So thinking in terms of a network of circular economy villages is the way we describe it. And another way of thinking about it is from an Indigenous perspective, is to think about these as the waterholes connected by songlines. So instead of thinking of just the settlements, we need to think of a network of places that are connected and integrated, and we navigate life by traveling from place to place or connecting between them. So we can then start thinking as well about not just the settled life, but the nomadic life that connects the places. And this is a paper that was published last year about what the strategic planning processes would be needed in order to create this distributed network. And some concepts that an architect is now starting to develop for us. And here you can see the idea of using biomimicry and principles of, or natural patterns, if you like, to create the design of these places. So enhancing the water cycle, using the nautilus shape, for example, as a way of designing the transport system or the movement system within the place. And this is just a aerial view of that same place. And this is just a hamlet, a view of the hamlet from the inside. And this image kind of tries to illustrate the idea that we shouldn't be building on the land, we should be building in the land and retain our connection with place, design for place, and integrate into it as much as possible. So that's basically the presentation, that we shape our cities and thereafter they shape us. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. That was very efficient. Some wonderful comments in a short amount of time. While people have a little think, and if they've got any questions, you can either type them in the chat and I'll read them out, or you're very welcome to raise your hand and do this if it's on the screen, or press the little button. Steve, one question I have for you is, I'm aware of the wonderful work that you and others have been doing in this space. In terms of the polis plan idea of these interconnected villages, communities, where are things up to in terms of getting traction on getting a few started to show us how awesome they are?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because yesterday we had an inception meeting with Bellingen Council to so we've started a project part funded by state government to work with Bellingen and their planning framework to develop an approval pathway for circular economy villages. So what would they need to do? How would they assess an application that came in that had, it was a concept scale, so village scale, and how would that affect their infrastructure planning? How would that affect their rates? How would you rate it? What waste levies would they charge if you're managing all your own waste? So that's the project that we're starting now. We're developing that pathway with Bellingen Council. We're working with an architect to do some concepts that will serve as part of the consultation engagement with the community, as well as pitching it to future investors as well. So we're just starting on that process as well.
That's fantastic. That's really exciting. Well done.
On its way, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, fantastic. We've got two questions. I think they're going to ask the questions. We've got Jai and then Scotty. can't actually see you. I'm sorry, Joy. Can you just turn yourself off mute? Oh, there you are. And ask your question.
Hi there. I'm just curious about the advent of vertical farms for being a part of the kind of new, I guess, agricultural model.
We don't want to be prescriptive about, you know, what systems should be used. I think the general principle is as much as possible to integrate, use natural systems to produce the food. Vertical farms, you know, can be a bit, you know, depends exactly what model you're talking about, but they can be a little bit more mechanical, if you like. But there's certainly a place for them in creating an abundance of food, which is the principal intention here. How do we create as much food as we can within the places that we're living? So we're agnostic about the technology. But the general principle we would always work with is how can you maximize the production integrated with natural ecosystems as much as possible.
Thank you, Steve. Scotty, over to you. And then I have a question from Michelle Smith to come to. Oh, that's fantastic. Scotty, Scotty, can you hear us? You sound delightfully like a chipmunk. Like literally a chipmunk. I don't know if you want to type your question. Might be the quickest option. I'm so sorry, but it's not even a chipmunk we can understand. You type your question if you can. I'll put you back on mute if that's all right, although I could listen to that all day. It's hilarious. In the meantime, you type your question, Scotty. I'll come back to you. In the meantime, we have a written question from Michelle Smith. Sustainably and ethically produced meat is more expensive to produce than the factory versions. Is there a case for meat to be more expensive, noting that problems of income inequality are to be dealt with via an incomes policy, not through prices?
Well, that's a big question. Firstly, you're talking about monetary costs for food, and in our model, we're talking about use values rather than exchange values. And what I mean by that is we're talking about how can a community produce all the food that it needs without monetary exchange? How can they use, you know, the energy they generate, the water systems they have available to them, the collaborative energies of the people working there, the capacities of the natural ecosystems, and produce all the food that they need without attaching a monetary value to it. So we are talking about new economies, and this is a new economic model that is, it's kind of, if you think about it, our current system has two economic operating systems. At the household scale, within the household, everything is done for free. It's a gift economy. And outside the household, everything is exchanged for money. If we increase that scale of the household to a village scale where everything is a gift economy, using, you know, we could call it a steady state economy because there's you're circulating materials within it and keeping it stable for a discrete population, then there's no exchange values attributed to it. So I'm answering that question in a completely different way than maybe you expected, but the underlying assumption of your question is that everything has a monetary value, and we want to shift away from that notion. I'll allow you to offer a follow-up question if that was not to your satisfaction.
Thanks, Steve.
That was great. Thanks very much, Stephen. That's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah. And in fact, it's a way that we look at a lot of things inside the NENA Wellbeing ALA space, rethinking value, big theme in the work that we're all doing, I think. Scotty, have you got your question there, Dale? I can't find it yet.
Well, let's see. How does that sound?
Hang on. We can hear you.
Yes.
You sound like a man, not a cartoon.
Left and reconnected.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you're using an architect to design the thing. I've got architect skepticism, and I'm wondering if the architect is trained in further things like permaculture design, or looking at enterprise stacking out of polyface farms, or doing other sort of stuff. Are they just a straight architect who's found a nice nautilus shape in nature and thought, oh, that'll be nice, we'll just whack a few things in here? Or what's going on with that?
Yeah, it's interesting. The way we've approached the model that we're developing is that we never sort of go out and look for people. What we've found is that when you need a particular service, serendipity, it just seems to come across your desk. And this guy has been working on a similar project in South America. He was previously from Italy, was moved to New York, and now he's based in Sydney. And he's looking to do exactly the kind of projects that we're talking about. So he was already aligned. He had already done some visualizations of similar projects. So some components of the village he had already imagined separately. And so our paths have pretty much just aligned, and he's keen to be involved in, and we're talking about a pipeline of projects. So yeah, we're looking for long-term partnerships with people who are aligned in all the principles. And, we also gave him a fairly extensive brief about what we were looking for. And, we gave him the nautilus pattern, we gave him, the water system. Yeah, so he's very much aligned, but, we're learning from each other, and, he has complementary skills to what we have. So never fear.
Yeah, I was going to say, thanks for the question, Scotty, and nice to hear your voice return to normal. Steve, there's a question written this time by Guy, and he says, are we going to have to get large levels of the population trapped in what David Graeber would call bullshit jobs that don't actually produce anything into these agri-circular village models to sustain our growing food needs?
Yeah, certainly a shift from bullshit jobs to meaningful, productive, collaborative work that we can do together. Definitely we need that shift. It is all about mobilizing populations. It's not about dictating the approach, but just from when you start with the physics of natural systems, which kind of the presentation was trying to illustrate, that if we work with the actual physics of energy in, energy out, we need a much more regenerative circular system. And to be fair, what we're working on is building on a lot of work that has been done by people trying to develop eco-villages, co-housing developments, permaculture principles. All of that has a long history, and all we're doing is really synthesizing a lot of those ideas and reframing them in a way that they can be adopted by the current town planning system. Because once you have that process in place, it allows it to be readily replicated, rather than the current problem with building an eco-village is it's just not recognized by the planning system. So they can take 10 years to get off the ground. By that time, everyone's exhausted, and people have dropped off because it's taken too long to get the outcome they need. So yeah, we see, this being an ongoing process of a network of villages that need to be built in order to enable this transition. And that'll then allow some retrofitting of existing cities to integrate food, water and energy systems within the existing built environment. But this is just to demonstrate what the future could look like. So that's what us working on a pilot project is about, to give people a place that they can touch and feel and live in which they can see what it would be like to live in a different way, in a circular, regenerative way.
Excellent, thank you. Got one more question. Hang on. Michelle Smith, did you? Oh, sorry, I didn't see your hand. Would you like to just go off the mute and speak, or would you like to type?
Yeah. So yeah, just a quick question. What do you think of human manure?
what do I think of it? I think it's a natural, yeah, we are all natural animals, and I can't speak to the technical issues or problems with using that for food production. I imagine there's some systems that we can do to manage any sort of pollutants or issues with that. But I think a lot of the poisons and issues that we have with our own sewerage has to do with things that we're putting into our bodies in the first place. And if we could more carefully manage what we put into our water systems and what we put on our bodies, then what comes out would be much less of a concern.
Good stuff. Poopy stuff, but good stuff. Thank you very much. What we might do now, Steve, is we'll turn to Michelle Miller, and then at the end, if time permits, we'll bring you both back together for just a couple of final questions. So if everyone could either press the magic button that shows their appreciation or do a Daggy air clap. Thank you so much, Steve. And it's really terrific for me personally to hear the update or updates about the work that you've been doing. So it's very exciting. All right. So I will now ask Michelle to step forward into the spotlight in a Zoom sense. Welcome, Michelle, and I might leave it to you to introduce yourself and this discussion space that you've created in our session. Thank you.
Hi there. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Michelle. It's great to have a chance to chat to you today. From what Stephen has just shared, what I'm going to do is take you to a completely different context. So imagine yourself out in Western New South Wales somewhere. This is the land of ringers Western and four-wheel drives and cattle dogs. And so now that we're in place, imagine there being a lot of dust. So now that we're in the place that we are talking about, this particular presentation is working around agriculture as a something that we can wrap economies around. So inverting that paradigm that Stephen was just talking about. And a little bit about me. So I am currently a PhD candidate at UTS in transition design. As part of that, I've got a business experiment called Transition Ag, and I also work for the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. And my PhD research is about practice. How do we actually bring about transition? And so the field is transition design. And to work on practice, I needed to choose a project. So I've undertaken an action research project looking at transitioning to regenerative agriculture. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit about that practice framework, as well as a little bit about what I'm learning about what it's going to take to actually bring about a regenerative agriculture. And so that means I've got a bit of detail with you. The most important thing is for you to take away the essence of it. It's a really rough first synthesis of stuff, so don't hold me to all my words just yet. But as I work through this, I've got a couple questions for you. So my first question, as you listen to this, is what practices truly facilitate transition? And the next question is, as I talk through the different opportunities that are coming up in the research, what opportunities do you see for regenerating agriculture for a well-being economy? So I'm just going to hit a couple of those points again. So my research, it's an action research approach. I've basically jumped into the world of agriculture, not coming from an agriculture background, but as a design practitioner researcher. I'm basically working as a change agent. So that's meant a lot of workshops, working groups with different farmers, interviews with farmers all over New South Wales, whether they're innovators or early adopters or new transitioning or part of the sector. Now, we all have different awarenesses of the term regenerative agriculture, but I just want to point out that there's a giant argument about what regenerative agriculture actually means. So pretty much everybody agrees on the term regenerative. So this idea that it's about self-healing and renewal, but what it means as agriculture is under a lot of debate, and the debate is quite hotly contested because the term is getting co-opted and greenwashed. But when I listened to farmers, what I came away with was actually a really different definition that is currently in the common parlance. So a lot of existing definitions focus on things like, oh, it's about soil health. But when I listened to farmers, what they were telling me was that the reason why regenerative agriculture works for them is because they are using the regenerative qualities of nature as the basis and driver of their production. So it's not achieving conservation alongside production, it is achieving conservation through production. And so I found that that term helps resist a lot of the greenwashing, but it is not a common definition. And that greenwashing, you can see this quote from Tyson Yunkaporta. Perhaps this is in reference to his own work, but it applies in this case as well to regenerative agriculture. Perhaps the worst possible outcome of this work is that civilization embraces the ideas because of that co-opting of terms. So when I talk about regenerative agriculture, this is what I mean. I don't mean all the many other definitions that are out there. So as I said, I'm working on research into practice, and I'm offering to you my first draft synthesis. A little bit about that, I've got a theoretical framework I'm working from, and in that it is there's a theory of action, because I'm studying practice, so how we go about undertaking transition, and a theory of change. So what are we transitioning to? Like the vision that Stephen presented to you, what are those visions and narratives of change? And then within that, where are each of the opportunities to make something different? And then when it comes to practice, I'm looking at a practice framework as well as activities that are specific to transition design. So for today, I want to share with you a bit about the practice framework and a bit about the transition opportunities, this giant smash up. So again, we're looking at practice framework and regen ag transition opportunities, knowing that in the background, visions and narratives are there and that specific actions are there. So firstly, I want to talk you through the framework, and then I'll talk you through the opportunities. I'm zooming through this because I'm going to go through it in detail, don't worry. So practice framework, acting in relationship, what's the detail underneath that? I wanted to give you a bit of a flavor of what's underneath each of these so that the headlines or titles don't read too glibly. Because what does it mean to actually engage deeply in work that facilitates transition? And so starting first with respect and cultural responsiveness, changing the story into one of connection and interbeing, bridging cultures and mindsets and approaches, designing pluriversally, so not thinking we're all going to one single future, and perhaps underscoring all that aligned with creation. So how we practice is in relationship. From there, in order to move together, connecting to intrinsic motivation and commitment. I use that word commitment in the theory U, sort of sense of commitment of people to action, but also that intrinsic motivation in linking back to a lot of place-based collective action. What is it that motivates us to come together, to work together across boundaries, and even if we're doing different things? So tapping into norms, cultural norms of responsibility and care, particularly drawing and bringing back and honoring Indigenous ways of being on the planet, knowing that change never happens through coercion. It's about choice. It is having the courage to lead from the heart, taking a strengths-based approach, honoring gifts, looking for that self-organizing energy and working with momentum. So then the practice framework is about how do we know where to act? And so we are looking for those places where our dreams and our visions, our narratives, and our realities don't match. And let's not choose the little things. Let's tackle the big things and stay with the trouble. So healing and reconciliation, our knowledge and dialogue processes, recreating day-to-day systems, processes, and conditions, how our systems manifest in the day-to-day, because our systems are produced by our actions in every moment. Reimagining rituals, customs, narratives, and to bring out some language that different First Nations people are using, giving us that permission to re-indigenize, to become indigenous to place, and to reconstruct our cultures around that. And then changing, revaluing power and authority and identity. From there, we need some sort of means of acting. So experimenting to recognize regenerative ways forward. How do we know of the many things we could do, what's really going to work? It's not always obvious what we truly regenerative. And so to get there, drawing upon design practice, how might we be experimenting? And so it's participatory, it's co-producing at different scales, forms, frames, and leverage points in systems. So it's a complex systems view, to quote Melanie Goodchild, that making sure to always hold that irreducible wholeness and looking for ways forward where the whole, the thing that we're asking for, is in the part. So just transition, for instance, talks about having, there's no such thing as a just future if the means to get there are not also just. And then from there, verbs, not nouns. So process and the act of being in transition as the purpose, and being very careful with the solutions and the answers that we are finding. Working over long horizons and having processes for noticing, sensing, reflecting, that muddling through. And then we are looking for what is regenerative. Regenerative in its kernel of its idea is something that has a life of its own. It reproduces, it renews on its own. So we are looking for ways forward that regenerate our energy, our culture, our well-being. They're self-producing, autonomic, and they become demotic, so of day-to-day life. So this is the practice framework. Now what we're going to do is smash that up and compare that with what are we actually doing with agriculture. So a bunch of categories. I'll go through them one by one quickly. So firstly, farming mindsets, capabilities, and practices. So changing and supporting farmers to farm differently. So not linear, not reductionist, but rather being able to read and manage into complex, uniquely Australian novel ecosystems, where we look to weave together non-Indigenous and Indigenous wisdom and select the practices that truly nurture and regenerate farming, family, and community well-being. Then in education, extension, training, so those practical skills, there's a lot of education that focuses on science of agriculture, but doesn't necessarily teach farmers to be farmers, and how to make holistic decisions that factor in their own economics, their own social structures, their own ecologies, and enabling them to make use of that depth of agroecological, social, and technological skills. So not being green lovers and hippies and ignoring technology, but bringing it all together into a much more sophisticated sense of how we practice agriculture that is aligned with creation. So this is a giant bucket, supply chain, processing, distribution, markets. But the qualities of those, there is a thread looking at how can they be local, small scale, inclusive of different types of people from different backgrounds, as well as cooperative, incorporating waste management, like Stephen was mentioning, and bringing that back into relationship with farmers, and bringing consumers back into relationship with farmers and produce. And then from there, not just looking at farmers as the epicenter of change, but actually looking at how farming communities and the sector works together to regenerate at scale. So novel, not just indigenous ecosystems, or sorry, excuse me, native ecosystems. I won't use that word wrongly. So native not just native ecosystems, but novel ecosystems, and catchment regeneration and stewardship across many scales. So whether it's land manager collaborations, through land care efforts, through grassroots organizing, through natural resource management, an approach that is perhaps more spiritual than bureaucratic, but enabled by funding and grant structures, mutualizing and commoning structures as well. For policy and government, so policy that favors small to medium-sized collective, inclusive, and post-ownership models, non-extractive export paradigms, if there is such a thing, not just local, but cosmo-local, and alternative economies, food sovereignty, and social and economic justice. The AFSA, Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, as well as Just Transitions, will underscore that it's not possible to have a truly regenerative agriculture where there isn't social and economic justice. And science, research, and measurement. So the paradigm of science isn't necessarily helping us. It is aligned with reductionist approaches. And so what is that farmer-friendly holistic science, research, and measures that are integrative of ecology, biology, chemistry, complex adaptive systems, and indigenous knowledges? And then our economic mechanisms, our financial, capital, investment, insurance mechanisms, having mechanisms that are fit for and at the right scale of the different types of models and different types of people that are involved, and supportive of alternative economies and non-extractivist options. Now, everything I've just run through here, there are examples of this that actually already exist here in New South Wales, in Victoria, and Queensland. Sort of the future is already here, but it's just not evenly distributed. And so if we think about all of those many possibilities and things that it takes to bring about a truly regenerative agriculture, together with our practice framework and how to be and how to work together as a practice to bring those about, I go back to my original questions for you, which were around what is that wisdom we're holding about what truly creates transition? What are the practices that truly create transition? And what are the opportunities that we think are the most powerful ones in agriculture to create a well-being economy? So those are my questions for you, and I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Michelle. And I'm sorry for that. There's always a minute, a half a second, or whatever it is of silence. It's not that we're not listening. We're trying to find the unmute button. So, thanks very much, Michelle. I don't know if you wanted to take your share screen off, perhaps, and make yourself a little larger to the group. Yes. Does anyone have any questions, comments, or responses for Michelle? I'm wondering, Steve, in particular, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you, as a co-panelist, have any thoughts or comments. Jai actually has a question for you, Michelle. Just wondering, what are some key projects that you're interested in Australia, or any other researchers or policymakers who are taking this forward?
A few different answers for you. So I'll start with the second half first. Researchers or policymakers taking this forward. Last year, a fellow by the name of Adam Wilson published a policy paper for resetting our water management policy, which is hugely contentious in Australia and is also the subject of a lot of rights abuse. I had thought that we would see some sort of acknowledgement from government about that policy throwdown, because it was a really comprehensive, thoroughly researched paper that contained a lot of ideas, to be fair, but it was meant to be provocative. And I never heard a response to it. Now, of course, I'm not in the know with these things, but I thought there would have been some sort of discussion or acknowledgement. So there's stuff there. There are all sorts of policy experiment suggestions available to really change how we manage water, which is so critical. On that same thread, there are landholder collaborations for catchment level water regeneration. My partner does a lot of work with Peter Andrews, and looking at the scale of catchments as farmers and land managers, and working on how water is managed so that the underlying functionality of landscape is there. So it's not just water management, but also landscape functionality. Putting that together at that scale sets the basis for much better and greater production for all farmers involved. So projects like that are really important. And then from there are a lot of people, Tammy Jonas in AFSA, she does pigs as one of the many things they do, and they've been trying to get local abattoirs as a random example. So if you are a regenerative farmer and you produce meat ethically, without all of those costs that are embedded into that are not passed on to the consumer. So if you are producing meat ethically, you still have to send your animals to a normal slaughterhouse. And so that means that at the end of their lives, they are treated just like everything else, sold just like everything else. And if you actually want to sell a better product, if you want to sell locally, you don't have options. And so getting local abattoirs working, Gabe Brown, what they ended up doing is forming a cooperative in order to actually make that happen in the United States. So there's so many projects, actually. I just keep listing projects. I actually do, in my scoping research paper that is on my Transition Ag website, I do actually go through, and for each of those categories, name and list lots of existing projects and initiatives. So heaps.
Michelle, just a small thing. One of our folks has asked if you could turn up your volume just a little bit. I think you might be a bit soft, but it could also be there at their end, because I can hear you okay. Steve, did you have a comment before I come? There's another couple of questions here for Michelle.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I'd just like to ask, right at the beginning, you talked about the definition of regenerative agriculture. And again, as all these emerging terms are, they're contested ideas. I noticed you used Charles Massey, and he's been an inspiration for us as well. And one of the things he said was, the hardest place to regenerate, or the most difficult land to regenerate, is the land between our two ears. And essentially the shift is away from thinking of ourselves as farmers to thinking ourselves as land managers, and that food production is an outcome rather than, you know, our sole focus. And particularly that the discussion you had there about water, you know, food production is primary, and then water is an input or a consequence, rather than thinking of it as a food water integrated system. And so I guess it's a question around silo thinking to systems thinking, which you know, I'd like to put to you in terms of the definition, that we need to think more in systems terms rather than prioritizing one aspect like food systems over everything else.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that's quite interesting is that farmers tend to be quite natural systems thinkers, but the dominant model of agriculture has trained farmers to think very reductionist and very formulaic. So, okay, I've got this cash crop I want to produce. I'm going to go to my local supplier. I'm going to get a prescription for how much chemical I should put on. I'm going to put it on in these specific applications at this, you know, specific nano minuscule amount per plant at each specific moment. It's very, very precisely timed, and that recipe is going to give me production. And so that's very much inputs based, chemically based production. And so if we then recenter a definition of or the paradigm of agriculture as something where agriculture operates because we work with the life-giving properties of nature, with the complex adaptive systems that are nature. Our job as land managers is stewarding those complex ecosystems, and the production is we're just taking the cream off the top. So we've got the whole cake, and the cake, we are managing it. We are not eating our cake. We are just taking the cream off the top. And that is how we live and sustain ourselves. And so that allows for a having that paradigm. It also changes how farmers see the success, that paddock between their ears, how they feel about what makes them a successful farmer. It's no longer, oh, look how neat and tidy your paddocks are, not a thistle in sight. It's like, oh, look at those thistles. They must be, you know, they're doing their job. They're out there in the paddock. They're fixing the soil, and they're part of a natural progression. And when they're through, I'm going to have a fixed paddock. And it's going to be much healthier. Oh, and by the way, if I graze at a certain time, they're actually edible. So, and so absolutely, the paradigm gives it. So the paradigm of regeneration, if we stick to it and are true to it, it actually gives farmers a chance to what they describe as stop going out and killing things. So they get up in the morning and think, okay, what have I got to go kill today? And come back to a paradigm of what can I grow today? And it by working in that way, it's healing our hearts from the outside in. And then as farmers begin to heal their hearts, the things that the farmers I talked to spoke about were feeling so much better, that they were working with nature and having so much more time in their day, and being far more attuned to, because they were making decisions holistically, working with their families, being much more attuned to their families and feeling that their families are healthier and thriving, having more time to invest in the community. The benefits just flow on and on and on. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. We've only got about 5 minutes left. What I did want to do is mention that Scotty Foster has shared a link about some of the work that he and the gang in Canberra have been up to. And he's also asked, Michelle, could you put in a link to the list of projects by categories? I think he means in the chat. So that's if you're able to. Otherwise, maybe you two can private message and catch up and share info. So before we sign off, we've got, like I say, about 3 or 4 minutes now. Steve and Michelle, just to wrap up, I wonder if you have any questions for each other, given your very different but connected work. Or I'm just trying to see if there's a connecting question. No.
I was very much interested in Scotty's question about the basis for which how the cities are designed, because and I was glad to hear that you talk about not being attached to one way of doing it, but working through different, multiple experiments, and then also.
Right, Michelle, you're getting really soft again. Could you speak up a little bit more?
I think it must be something in my my speaker. I do apologize. So okay. I appreciated your response to that, and I think there's sort of it is both and. How do we build food systems into our cities, as well as all of the other systems back into our cities, but also how do we make opportunities and non-shitty jobs, life opportunities back in communities. Some of the farmers that I talked to, they talk about the irony of how the only way to win in the current game is to buy your neighbor, and eventually in a span of 100 kilometers you only have 2 families left, and there's nobody to play on the kids' football team. And so I was curious what you might think about the ideas that are in your work and how that then might apply out to, say, Cobar.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the narrative since the Industrial Revolution has been to kind of industrialize the farm, reduce the number of farm workers, and those farm workers go into the city and do urban bullshit jobs that you described, just to keep the machine going. And it's just an urban, clinical, disconnected environment, disconnected from our food system. And essentially what we're saying is we need to step outside of those city limits, where we imagine sort of out there it's kind of bush and dangerous and whatever, and the nice safe zone is in the cities, and sort of redistribute populations, allow people to connect with the land. I mean, that's so the land, the image that we gave is of a really fertile environment, and Bellingen is one of the highest rainfall areas, certainly in New South Wales, but the same principles can apply to more rural areas. It's about regenerating natural systems, and instead of, flushing your organic material down the toilet or throwing it in the tip, that you actually regenerate the landscape. And by improving, focusing, like the way natural systems work is, you start from the creek lines, the gullies, and you regenerate that, and you create a chain of ponds, and that chain of ponds becomes a fertile zone that feeds into your waterways that might be dry at the moment, but with that regeneration become much more fertile areas. So I'm not saying that the arid zones in Western New South Wales can become like Bellingen because the rainfall isn't there, but the population would need a larger area and work within the conditions that are available. But the principle is the same, that you enhance the systems, you improve the soil health, improve the water systems, and that'll give you greater fertility. And then it's kind of a positive cycle, as opposed to the extractive one where we're constantly degrading the land and making it more arid and increasing the droughts and extreme weather events. We're working in the opposite direction and having a positive impact on the land through our daily activities of food production. So it's that. So I see we're equally keen to work in more arid areas as in the Bellingens, but it would just be easier to get a pilot project up in an area like that where people really want to go to. So yeah, that's the general gist of, I hope I answered, the question that you asked.
There's research out there that talks about, and this is why people are so excited about regenerative ag, is that the more you cover the land with plants, and the more you keep plants there all the time, the more you bring back rain, the more you build soil health, the more you moderate climate, the more you sequester carbon. And we talk only about the carbon sequestration piece so often, but it is the whole system's impact that creates climate resilience. And that's what's so exciting about it, is that it is actually possible.
Yeah. But it also, it requires more people working the land. We can't just mechanize everything and have the fossil fuels and the tractors doing the work. People have to be on the land. And one of the, some of the statistics we use is like before the Industrial Revolution, 75% of the population worked in agriculture. And we've come down in Australia to around 2%. If we could just get it up to around 8 to 10%, that would be enough to feed everybody and create an abundance. But, it does require more hands involved, and not all the time being farmers, not a return to agrarian lifestyle, because you're using the technology and the knowledge of water systems and so on to make an efficient system. But, on those peak times when you have harvests or whatever, that you need a few hands on deck, that the people are there because they're going to consume it as well.
I hate to interrupt a wonderful conversation, but people are jumping off because they're going to the next session. And I'm sure we've got other people trying to get into this one. So look, I really want to say thank you. I've really enjoyed that discussion. And Steve, Michelle, I hope that you guys can continue discussions into the future together too. And can I just give a little plug for the Green Prince approach? It would suggest that all regenerative agriculture actually has to fit within the living world's natural space and system in a particular place, ecosystem or bioregion. We cannot force the desert to have vegetation cover if that's not really the way it was designed, but we can encourage the restoration and the life, bringing life back to a place that's been destroyed. But that's just my little rant. I'm now going to say a huge thank you to both of you. And hope to see you again in another session soon. I'll see you tomorrow. And for everyone in the audience who's still here, thank you so much. We'll stop the recording now. I'm going to hand over to Rhiannon Hardwick, and she's going to commence the next session. So thank you, Michelle.
Thanks. That was great.
Research. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Scotty.